Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining today. For those who do not know me, my name is Homeira Baghbanmoshiri. I'm a PhD student at Kobe University Graduate School of Humanities. Although I'm about to graduate in a few weeks, and in fact, today's presentation is about the theme of my PhD thesis and the subject that I have been working on in the past 3 years. So the title is Analyzing the Cultural Identity of Video Games through the comparison between Final Fantasy and the Witcher game series, both of which are role-playing games, and I will be comparing the player character and the game world in these two games. Before we start, I want to give a quick explanation why I have chosen this subject, especially that we are talking about identity and cultural identity in the context of postmodern media, where these concepts are very vague. But I think it is important to pay attention to these things because both the company, especially in the context of serialized media, where both the company that are producing them are trying to establish an identity that stands out from their competition. And at the same time, the audience of these games are creating their own culture and their own identity surrounding the consumption of these serialized medias. In the beginning, when I was starting, because I was comparing a Western RPG with a JRPG, there was a little bit of meaning of like geographical and national cultural meaning to it, but in the end, it turned out to be more about the fan culture, the fandom culture surrounding them. Well, like more specifically in this context would be a little bit of otaku culture with the fandom surrounding some high fantasy literature such as Tolkien's work, H.P. Lovecraft, George R.R. Martin, or in this case, it would be Andrzej Sapkowski. And I do not mean to say that these two cultures are like separate from each other. In fact, there are many common grounds between them. There are many in fact, one of these common grounds is role-playing games, and that is why I believe it is important to analyze this subject. And the flow of this presentation, it can be divided into 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk about the keywords. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these concepts, but I want to establish the meaning, the definition that I am using in this study. Then I'm going to talk about the methods that I'm going to be using for analyzing the games. Then there will be a short introduction of the games for those who are not familiar with these series. And finally, the analysis itself. Well, starting with the role-playing game itself. So if we look back historically, the first tabletop role-playing game is Dungeons and Dragons, which was created by combining strategic war games with the idea of being able to role play as a specific character in that scenario. And the themes that they used for those games was borrowed from fantasy books such as Lord of the Rings. Later, these games were translated into computer games so that the players would be able to play them by themselves. And then these CRPGs were imported into Japan and they became popular there. And in Japan, they start to make their own role-playing games as well. RPG can refer to a very wide range of games, and there are many games from other genres that also use features from role-playing games. But in this study, there are 3 fundamental rules that I will associate with RPGs, which is that the players will be role-playing as one or more characters, and these characters have this simulated skills. It means that they have a set of skills that is different from the skills of the player. And the players can level up, gain XP and ability points in order to change and manage these skills of these characters. And of course, we have the Western RPG and the JRPG. The Western RPGs are usually more action-based, and players can create their own avatars. And the choices that they make has more significant impact on the progression of the story, while as in JRPGs, there is this turn-based battle system, and the characters are predefined, and there's a linear narrative. These are the common differences that we can find between JRPG and Western RPG. But one of the aims of this research was to understand what are the other differences here and why these differences exist, which I will go into deeper discussion later in the presentation. The next keyword is the game world. And Zakal and Detterding define the game world based on two features, the constitution and the theme. The constitution of the game world, specifically in the context of CRPGs, is defined as a computational model generating audiovisual representations, which then the players can interact with it, and then the model will update itself in accordance to how the players are interacting with it, in accordance to the input of the player. In this study, I will be analyzing the constitution based on the concept of space and time, because later I'm using Mikhail Bakhtin's theory of chronotrope in order to analyze the games. And I go over like many different theories of what is space and what is time and what is space-time in the context of video games. But to put it briefly, my aim is to understand how the players are experiencing the space-time of the game. What is the space-time of the game is representing, which is not irrelevant to the theme of the game. So the theme is also affecting this space and time. If we specifically talk about The Witcher, the theme of The Witcher can be defined as this grim, dark fantasy genre, while as Final Fantasy has a more of like mixture of genres that we can find in many Japanese pop cultures, such as shonen manga. Again, I will go into deeper discussion about these subjects. The next keyword is the player character, which basically the character that the players are playing as they are playing the game. And we can define the PC in a spectrum, which at one end we have the character, which is this fictional being, separate than the players, and the players recognize them as being different than themselves because they have their own personality and their own features. But on the other hand, we have the avatar, which is the projection of the players in the game world. It is the puppet that the players have control over, and they can interact with the game world through that avatar. In role-playing games, especially in the games that we are analyzing here, the PC falls somewhere in the middle. It has a little bit of both sides. And that's where the double consciousness of play comes into play, is that like, while the players are playing the game, they identify with that player character, both as being this fictional, the separate fictional character and the extensions of themselves. So these two like happen at the same time while they are playing the game. And the last keyword is culture in context of video games. Culture in video games can be either reflective or transformative. Reflective means it reflects the culture that it was created in and is consumed in. And transformative means as the players are playing these games, they can change the meaning of the game in a way that it was not intended in the beginning. But not all games can be transformative. In this study, my focus is mostly on the reflective part of video games. And I go over many theories of how we can create cultural meaning in the context of video games, but my approach is mostly similar to Matsunaga Shinji's theories. Matsunaga has a specific article about JRPGs that he talks about what makes JRPGs Japanese. And in that article, he explains that usually when we are making a game, so if the game was going to, like, if we make the game very realistic, it would be very boring and mundane. Therefore, we have to make choices to stylize the game, to like include some features and ignore some others. And these choices are informed by our cultural context. And that is what I'm trying to do in this study, is to try to understand what were the choices that were made in creating The Witcher, and what were the choices in creating Final Fantasy, and what are the differences here. Moving on to the methods that I will be using. Earlier, I mentioned that I'm using Mikhail Bachtin's theory of chronotope. Chronotope basically is about the inseparability of space and time, meaning that if we are going to study space, we need to pay attention to time as well, and vice versa. So these two concepts cannot be separated from each other. In Bachtin's theory, chronotope describes a time-space nexus in which life exists and creativity is possible. This means that there is no experience outside of space and time. However, Bachtin himself is not concerned with the idea of chronotope in the context of reality. He's mostly concerned about what is time and space in literature, and how authors will create patterns of chronotope in order to tell a story, and how these patterns turn into genres. To explain it a little bit differently, so when an author is trying to tell a story, they will put like different events together. Like, for example, there's a girl who meets a boy and they fall in love, and then there is these obstacles on their way that prevents them from getting together immediately. But by the end of the story, they get together and they get married and live happily ever after. So each one of these events have its own time and space and its own small chronotope, and the authors create this pattern, which in the end create this one whole chronotope, which is the story as a whole. And sometimes these patterns get repeated and repeated and repeated. There are some small changes here and there, but the general pattern remains the same. And that is what we refer to as genre. In this case, we would have the romance genre. And specifically that I believe like this theory can be useful because we are talking about the RPG genre, what is like Western RPG, what is JRPG, and like later I'm going to talk about fantasy genres, and using this theory of chronotope will help to understand how these genres are structured. But additionally, I have defined two specific chronotopes for the purposes of this study. The first one is the historical chronotope. Historical chronotope is concerned with both how the game is referencing real-world history, and also the history of the game world itself, meaning that the game world has created its own, like it's this parallel universe that has its own time-space continuum. And so that is also part of the historical chronotope analysis. The next one is the progress chronotope. Progress chronotope will focus on investigating the potential transformation in the game state. Jasper Joule, one of the ways that Jasper Joule defines games is as a state machine. It means that game is a machine that can exist in multiple states, and as the players interact with the game, they change the state of the game in order to move forward and progress toward the goal of the game. And in the context of role-playing games, it's how usually it's about how they are changing the state of the player character. They level up and they manage the player's abilities. So progress chronotope is about how the game world is changing, how the player character is changing, and how the players are changing as they are playing the game. After I have identified the chronotopic elements in the games, I will analyze them based on two different perspectives. The first one is serial production, specifically Echo's theories in this regard. So earlier I mentioned that genres are these repetitive chronotopic patterns, and that is basically what seriality is, this repetitive patterns, although Echo argues that there is some novelty in these predictable patterns as well. There's like this underlying repetitive pattern, and on surface we have some sort of novelty and some sort of fresh feature. He also introduces multiple serial production methods, and these methods are the ways that the creators of these media are trying to create a balance between this novelty and predictability. An example of this is Echo's article about Myth of Superman, where he talks about how the heroic character in a serialized media such as comic books needs to combine two to extend contradictory features, that paradoxical features. On the one hand, because this is this heroic character, it needs to have this supernatural and ideal powers. And it needs to also be predictable so that the audience would feel this sense of familiarity with that character, to feel safe as they are consuming this serialized media. And it also needs to be immortal in a sense that because it's a serialized media, it needs to tell infinite stories, or like many stories about the same character. So in a sense, this character also needs to be immortal. But at the same time, because it is hard to identify with such a character, with such a like idealized features, that is why it needs to also have some humane features. It needs to be flawed and be vulnerable to change. So on one hand, it would be unpredictable. So because we're trying to tell new stories, and these new stories need to be exciting, so there need to be unpredictable in a sense as well. So, but if the character is changing, it means it's marching toward its death. So with each story that we are telling about this character gets older and like eventually would die, which is contradictory to the idea that we are trying to make a serialized media, and we need these characters to live forever, be immortal in a sense. Echo talks about the methods that have been used in comic books to like solve this paradox, which is basically the authors manipulate time in a sense that like when you read one comic book compared to like other comics books before and after it, you do not like have a clear understanding of where this one ends and where the next one begins. And because of this vagueness, like they can tell many stories without actually progressing the time of the world of that character. Here, I will also argue that in the games as well, there is this like these two features, these two paradoxical features exist, but there are other methods that are used to make them work together. The next perspective that I will be using in analyzing these games is from the perspective of simulation in the context of postmodern media. All games are simulation, but the simulation that we are talking about here is more broad. It's more general, and I'm specifically using Baudrillard's definition of a simulation. He explains that initially simulation is trying to replicate reality as best as it can, but it never is exactly the same as the real. And this simulation can continue to exist regardless of the real. It's no longer reliant of the real. So there might be a point where this real is gone, and because we no longer have any point of reference for that reality, this simulation replaces that reality, and now we understand that reality through this simulation. Azuma Hiroki also has a similar theory based on Bourdieu's studies, and he specifically talks about simulation in the context of Japanese pop culture media and otaku culture. And he identifies two features in this culture that makes him believe that this is also part of the postmodern discourse. The first one is the existence of derivative works, meaning that the fans are fan of like such as media such as like light novels, mangas, and animes, and these things start to make their own derivative work, their own fan art, which is then consumed the same way as the original. We cannot no longer tell the difference between this derivative work and the original, the simulation and the real. The second feature that he identifies is the importance placed on fiction. How I understand this part is that in the modern and pre-modern era, we would see a fiction and we would understand that fiction through reality. We would understand the reference of the fiction to the real. But now in postmodern era, it has turned out to be like we see reality through fiction. We reference the real to the fiction. He also talks about database theory, which is based on the like the idea of like there is no longer a grand narrative, and there is this database that anyone can take bits and parts and put them together to create their own small narratives. So both The Witcher and Final Fantasy are games that therefore there are simulations, and both of them are postmodern media, and that is why I believe that using these theories would be useful in analyzing these games. Later I will go deeper in these two discussions as I am analyzing the games. Getting to the introduction of the games, first we have The Witcher. The Witcher is based on a book series written by Andrzej Sapkowski, who is a Polish author. Originally, there were some TV series and movies based on the book in Poland, but they became popular worldwide with the release of the first game. And since then, there have been, the books have been translated in many languages, there have been more games, and now we have the Netflix show, and the universe of The Witcher is expanding as we are talking. And Polish, and like there are many, in the games specifically, there are many references to the Polish and Slavic culture. For example, there are references to the Polish literature, Polish history, and the game world, the architecture and the aesthetic of the game world is modeled after Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages. Although there are some references to other cultures, such as like there are references to Western Europe mythology and fairy tale. The gameplay of the game is very much like Western RPGs. There is this action-based battle system. Although you cannot create your own avatar, you're playing as Geralt of Rivia, who is a Witcher. And much like many other role-playing games, you can level up Geralt and like manage his skills and abilities. On the other hand, we have Final Fantasy. The first game was produced in 1987 by Squaresoft. Since then, there has been many games produced under the title of Final Fantasy. There are games in other genres that role-playing games. There are animations, mangas, music, albums that were like used in the games. There are sequels, prequels, remakes, etc. and etc. These are some of the games that I mostly focus on, although I do reference other games during my study, but these are the ones that I pay attention to more, like which is the Final Fantasy 1, 5, 7, 7 remake, 10, 12 international and 12 international Zodiac Job System, 13 and 15. I also have done like published an article about like where I look at the changes through these games, the changes that happen in the player character, and how you can interact with the game world in these specific games. I will not go through all the details, but I have like included this chart here for your reference. I thought that there's too much subject, so I'm just gonna move on from it right now. Now getting to the analysis itself, starting with the game world and historical chronotope. First, I'm gonna explain my hypothesis, then I will provide some evidence that I believe will support my theory. Here, so the game world in The Witcher and Final Fantasy is artificial. It is simulation. But here I like to argue that The Witcher is trying to present a coherent chronotope which appears logical and therefore natural, while as the chronotope in Final Fantasy is diverse, which results in juxtaposing some contrasting spaces together, which makes it result in like makes it seem artificial. Now, what I mean by this, starting with The Witcher, if I want to describe the world of The Witcher, I would say it's a dark depiction of the Middle Ages. You have this like world which a lot of the time has gloomy weather. There are deadly monsters roaming around, and there is war, and people are living in hunger, families are ruined, there are orphans, and this also affects the gameplay, where like players a lot of time are faced with choices which there is no good or bad answer to it, and whatever they choose, it may result in death of innocent people. So there is this moral ambiguity. This is something that we would define as, we would refer to as grim dark fantasy genre. A famous author in this genre is George R.R. Martin, who has written A Song of Fire and Ice and Fire, which the Game of Thrones series is based on. George R.R. Martin defines his work in contrast to a more romanticized version of Middle Ages, which we can find in Disney animations, for example, where like you have the beautiful princess and there is a knight on shining armor that comes and saves the princess, and they live happily ever after. In contrast, the grimdark, like people like George R.R. Martin believe that so the reality of Middle Ages is different. There was class differences, there was death and disease, and people were dying. And therefore, they believe that their version of Middle Ages is more realistic because it depicts these features in it. And I believe that The Witcher is also trying to do the same thing through two methods. The first one is the coherent chronotope, and the chronotope that we are talking about here is the chronotope of green dark fantasy and this dark depiction of Middle Ages. And it tries to be coherent, so it would appear that it is logical, that it makes sense for us. So therefore, we would accept it as being real. And it is not to suggest that reality is logical or makes sense. In fact, quite the opposite. The reality can be illogical, it can be confusing for us. But this is like what Bourdieu refers to as hyperreal, which he defines it as programmatic, metastable, perfectly descriptive machine that offers all the signs of the real and short circuits all its vicissitudes. And this hyperreal replaces reality, exactly because it makes more sense to us. It is easier to understand. It is easier for us to accept it as real. Therefore, this simulation, this hyperreal, replaces the real for us. And now that's how we understand that reality. And I believe like the same thing is happening in The Witcher as well. The second method that The Witcher is using is simulating history. And the history that I'm referring to here is not how the game is referencing real world history, the Middle Ages. Is the history in the game world itself, how time is passing in the game world. So earlier I mentioned like the game world in The Witcher is not real, it's artificial. It's information and numbers being generated in real time. Therefore, it has no real history of itself. But it is common practice for designers where they are making a 3D model, for example, they would intentionally add imperfections to that model to suggest history. As in, like, for example, if I'm modeling a sword, I would add a chip and add some scratches on the blade to suggest that this sword was used and therefore it has history. And I believe what happens in The Witcher and in grimdark fantasy in general is that it exaggerates these features. So by depicting death and destruction, it's trying to, because death and destruction are the ultimate form of change that is brought about any space through time. And that is like what I mean by simulating history here. But there are times that the real nature of the game, which is information, seeps through. And an example of this is the Witcher sense, where when you're using the Witcher sense in the game, all the, like, for example, the photorealistic features of the world, everything that makes it seem real is blurred. And then the parts that are pure information, the parts that are important for the purpose of the game, the interactive parts, are glowing, and that's the important part. The game still tries to like kind of like cover it up by saying, oh, this is Witcher sense, and Witchers have this keen sense that normal people do not have, and that's how they see the world. We still understand that it is part of the game mechanic and it is not necessarily part of the narrative world, for example, but we accept this as being part of the narrative world because we know we don't have any reference for how the Witcher sense would look like. But that's what it actually is. It shows an information part of the game world. On the other hand, we have Final Fantasy, which has this incoherent world design that suggests artificiality. I do not believe that Final Fantasy is intentionally trying to be artificial, but I believe that there is this emphasis in The Witcher in trying to be real, but that is absent in Final Fantasy. And there are some features in Final Fantasy that suggest this artificiality, and I have like included 3 of them here, which is blending genres, segmentation of a space, and anti-historic simulation, which I will go into each one of them. So from the very first game, when in the beginning of the first Final Fantasy game, we have this medieval fantasy setting where you have this castle, there's a king and tells you, go save the princess, and there are dragons. But soon after that, the game starts breaking these tropes and these genre conventions. For example, it starts mixing sci-fi elements. You have these robotic enemies that you need to fight. And we can find examples of these a lot, like numerous examples of this through the games, through the years. A more recent example of it is in Final Fantasy 15, where, for example, you have the capital city of Insomnia, which is based on Tokyo, and right outside of it, you have the Desert of Lade, which is based on the Midwest America, and how the characters are traveling from one diner to another. It reminds us of a road trip genre. And then you have Tenebreia, which is this magical castle right outside of a high fantasy setting, and right next to Tenebreia you have Niflheim, which has a lot of sci-fi elements to it. And then there's this part in the game where you're navigating through Niflheim. There are some horror genre features. There are jump scares, for example, and by the end of the game you have this part that is very post-apocalyptic. So this brings us back to earlier discussion about Hiroki Azuma and the derivative work. So as fans were making like these fan arts, like they would take the characters from like light novels and mangas and animes, and they would put these characters in different scenarios and tell new stories about them. And so what happens is that you would have the same characters from the same universe, but they are put in different genres. And this practice has found its way into the original works or the commercial works in a sense. And so therefore, light novels, mangas, animes, and also games are using these features. But why do I point it out here? It's because through the putting these different genres together, sometimes these genres do not really like, sometimes they contrast each other, so they don't blend to each other very well. So therefore, as we are playing it, we would recognize them as separate spaces, and this results in a segmentation of the space. This segmentation also happens in other ways while we are playing the game. Another example of it would be that the navigated space versus the battle space. As you're like walking through the game, suddenly there will be a random encounter, and the the space changes completely, and you go into this battle mode, and you need to fight enemies. And after you have defeated them, you will then be returned to the navigated space again. Another example of this is the chocobo rides. For example, if we compare it with how you ride a horse in The Witcher, so if you're on a horse and you encounter some monsters, the horse will get scared and it throw you off, and you need to defeat the monster and get back to the horse. It is a little bit like realistic in this sense, like how it might actually happen if you were on a horse and you encountered enemies. But in Final Fantasy, you specifically ride a chocobo in order to avoid monsters. So as you're riding the chocobo, the monsters for some reason do not attack you, which from realistic perspective doesn't make sense. Like, why wouldn't they attack you? But from the gameplay perspective, it works well, and it does what it needs to do. But it creates it separates the space of you being on the chocobo and the game world, and that makes it a little bit feel. That's what I mean by it being artificial. And on top of that, you have, for example, the chocobo tune. So even in the darkest time of the game, exactly when you get on the chocobo, this joyful tune will start playing, and it puts you in a different mind space than you had previously. And lastly, we have the anti-historic simulation. Again, by history here, I do not mean how it references reality, the real world history, but rather the time space in the game itself. For example, here we have this architecture, which is actually based on a real world historical monument, but because how it has been modeled does not necessarily represent the history, does not represent a passage of time, so it feels stylized, and therefore it doesn't it looks artificial in a sense. So circling back to the first slide, to conclude this part. So I believe that The Witcher is trying to simulate a world that, for the audience, it would seem that it has formed naturally, it has formed by itself through time, while as the game world of the Final Fantasy feels artificial, feels like someone put these spaces together to create this world that we are playing. And I do not try to say that it is not believable, or it's not immersive. It is, but the world of The Witcher is trying to appear more natural than Final Fantasy. Moving on to the next part, which is the player character and the progress chronotope. Earlier, I explained Echo's theory about how a heroic character in a serialized media needs to combine novel features with predictable features. I believe that this is possible in video games through the double consciousness of play. But how The Witcher is using it and how Final Fantasy is using it is different. So what happens is that Geralt in The Witcher is this mythical character which has many constant features, the predictable features. And what brings unpredictability to that character, what brings novelty into that character, is the player. But Final Fantasy is different, as the character is constantly changing. And what is constant in that scenario is the player's knowledge of the game. And I will explain what I mean by the things that I just explained. So in The Witcher, we have Geralt. Geralt has a very specific appearance. It has the white hair, it has the cat-like eyes, and the scars and everything. And he is a Witcher from role-playing terms. It is his class in a sense, and the class of a Witcher comes with a specific skill set, like using the sword to fight and having some alchemy knowledge and using a little bit of magic. And although you can level up Geralt and you can learn new skills, these skills never go outside of the circle. So if we even look at Witcher 1, Witcher 2, and Witcher 3, it's always these skill sets. And if we compare in the video games specifically, if we compare Geralt from the beginning of the story and the end of the story, he's more or less the same person. So by Echo's standards, we can define Geralt as being this mythical character, as this predictable character that does not change a lot. So where does this novelty and unpredictability come from? And I believe that comes from the players and how the players are interacting with the game world. They can bring this unpredictability into the character, or be that flawed part of the character. For example, if you encounter a difficult enemy, as a player, you would need to constantly load your game again and again and again and try again and again through a long period of time in order to be able to defeat this monster. During this time, Geralt as a character does not change. He's still Geralt. He's this heroic being who defeats the enemy and comes successful at the end of the fight. It is the players who are not good enough. There are players who are flawed and needs to practice a lot and change until becoming as good as Geralt. So here's so through the double consciousness of play, the players recognize this player character both as being this fictional character, which is a mythical being, and an extension of themselves who are flawed and unpredictable and changing. And these two parts combine together in the player character of Geralt. On the other hand, we have the Final Fantasy series, where the character and the game world is constantly changing from one game to another. There are some common tropes in JRPGs that we can see in Final Fantasy, which is you always have this young protagonist with absentee parent who go on a journey to self-discovery. But even then, the characters in the story are changing a lot. Even not only from one game to another, even in a single game, the characters are changing a lot from the beginning to the end. For example, earlier I mentioned how Geralt has a very specific skill sets, but Final Fantasy games are designed in a way that the characters can have any skill from any class at any time of the game. For example, in Final Fantasy VII, the characters do not even have a class. You have these materials that embody a specific skill. For example, equipping a specific material allows you to cast fire, or another one can make you stronger. And these materials can be equipped by any character at any time. Therefore, from the beginning to the end of the story, the characters change a lot. So from Echo's perspective, these are unpredictable. There is a lot of unpredictable features. The characters are constantly changing. So where does that predictability come from? And I believe that we can find it in the game mechanic and the understanding of players in the game mechanic, which is almost mathematical, and because it's mathematical, is very predictable. So for example, if you spend 5 hours in The Witcher, you might not be sure by the end of it that you will defeat this monster. So you still might not be good enough in defeating this monster after 5 hours. But while playing Final Fantasy, you might be like, okay, if I spend 5 hours, I can kill hundreds of these monsters, and each one of them would give me X amount of XP, and the total amount of XP would allow me to level up from level 20 to 24, and then I will have a higher level than the monster, and I will be able to defeat this boss, for example. So this mathematical structure gives this sense of reliability and familiarity for the players to rely on and be like, oh, I can win this game. It gives a reassurance to the players that they will be able to win no matter what. Another part that is constant from one game to another is the players' knowledge of the game as they are playing the game. So if you play a few games, you will gain this knowledge, for example, of monster behaviors, their weaknesses and strong points, or you might learn about in general skills and abilities. For example, people who have played Final Fantasy would be familiar with fire round, fire raga, and this is the structure of spells, or they would know what a Maiden's Kiss would do if they use that item. And there's also the strategies that you would use in battle, which, although the game mechanic in general changing a lot from one game to another in Final Fantasy, there are some general ways of fighting in battles that are still the same from one game to another. So Also, because even though the characters are changing from game to game, because the players are the same and their knowledge remains constant from one game to game, they can predict how they can progress through the game. Again, circling back to the first slide, so I believe like through this double consciousness of play, that the player character represents both this fictional character and the players as well, these games have managed to combine these paradoxical features, although their approach to this idea is different from one game to the other. Now, and this concludes my presentation, and I understand like there are a lot of weaknesses and there are a lot of parts in this research that can be like, we can work on more. Like one of the features that I wanted to work on but didn't have the time to do so was to understand the players' perspective, like how the players understand the games, how they understand the identity of these games. And I did some interviews with some players, but did not have enough time to do more interviews and analyze the results of those interviews. Yes, there's a lot more to be done here, but here's what I managed to do during my research period, and thank you all for your attention. This is the end of my presentation.